Hey, welcome to Guy Shrink. I'm Bill Roman here, hosting bi-monthly podcast on what keeps guys awake at night, rolls around in their head, gives them heartburn or whatever. I'm here with my good buddy and producer and good friend, Jordan Valdivia, as my partner in crime, and we're talking to Larry Godfrey today, Dr. Larry Godfrey, who's been another good friend for a long time. Worked for General Motors for a number of years. Now he's a college professor. And just an all-around, generally great guy. So, Larry, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Thanks, Bill. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, one of the question I'd like to start with everybody is, what keeps you awake at night?
You know, Bill, I like that question. You actually gave me a heads up on that, a couple of months ago that we were going to talk about something like this. And, what keeps coming back to me is a quote that you really like. Viktor Frankl, Man's Inhumanity Towards Man. And I think about this a lot, and you know what really bothers me lately is what I see as an ever-increasing decline in concern for others, kind of a decline in empathy, in civility, in compassion for other people. I could... one simple example of what I mean by that is just what it's like to drive on the highway these days. So I'd say within the last month, I've driven from Toledo to Frisco, North Carolina, and back. I've driven to Cincinnati and back twice. I was in Columbus yesterday and drove back. And there's such aggressiveness that's on the highway today. And I think the bedrock of that is this ever-increasing decline in civility, empathy, caring about other people.
So I guess what I'm hearing you say is what keeps me awake at night is no more Mr. Nice Guy.
For sure. And one of the things I think about that is that I don't think that that's intentional for most of us. I still greatly believe in the goodness of human nature. But I think that it's sort of insidious, and it just sort of creeps up on us and becomes this idea that I'm not even thinking about the other guy. Just get out of my way. I mean, the people that want to tailgate you when you're doing 5 miles over the speed limit, and they want to tailgate you because they want you to get out of the way because they're going 20 miles over the speed limit.
So do you think some of us wake up in the morning saying, I think I'm going to be a dick today?
I think there might be a couple, Bill, but for the most of us, no.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah,
that's good to hear.
Yeah. So back to that, I think that we just get lost in ourselves, and so it's. I've made up my mind. Don't confuse me with any facts. I'm going where I'm going, and whatever is important to you doesn't matter to me.
Well, Larry, it hasn't always been that way. You and I have talked about that over the years. What do you think's happening that this is the kind of the movement, at least in your idea, that we're moving towards? What's up with that, do you think?
I think the bedrock of all of this is something I like to call radical certainty.
Okay.
And radical certainty, in a nutshell, is I am so absolutely right that I'm correct, that my thoughts, my ideas, my opinions are the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, that I don't need to consider anything else. And I think that's not science. That's not something that leads us to thinking about the other.
So I'm impervious to any outside information that might challenge my either position or my opinion or my thought. Is that what you're saying?
For sure. In psychology, we have a concept called cognitive bias, which means that all of us have opinions, have ideas about what we think is correct. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. Those come to us by way of our experiences and how we interpret those experiences. But those are not truths. They may be your truth. They're not the collective truth. What is the collective truth?
So who was it that said everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts? I think somebody said something like that. And I do know that David Brinkley, that great journalist, wrote a wonderful little book called "Everyone's Entitled to My Opinion."
Yeah, I'm not sure who said that, but lots of clever quotes like that. Don't trouble me with the facts. I've made up my mind.
Yeah, exactly.
That sort of thing. And I think another part of all of this is in this false narrative that us guys have to live with. This narrative that I'm strong, I'm independent, I'm certain, I never retreat, I don't back up. I think that gets built into us, even with all that we've seen since the civil rights movement, the women's movement, of the 60s. All that's happened that has helped us reach towards greater equality between the sexes. Us guys still grow up with this narrative. It's built into us in our nursery rhymes, snakes and snails and puppy dog tales, and by God, men are rough and they're independent and they charge forward. I think that's a fallacy. I think the fallacy of independence, of individualism, leads us down this road towards our cognitive bias, towards what it means to be a man, and our cognitive bias towards our radical certainty.
Well, wasn't it Alec de Tocqueville, the great French sociologist, way back in 1830, made that observation about America, rugged individualism?
Yeah, I think that's a fallacy, Bill. Now, there's nothing wrong with being rugged,
yeah.
or strong, or being an individual, but the greater need of society is the recognition of interdependence, not independence. Our very existence depends upon interdependence.
So what I'm hearing you say is one of the things that keeps you awake at night is this cultural KoolAid, so to speak, that guys have drunk deeply, and we don't know quite what to do with this change that's happening culturally, that's either more equitable or more open or whatever. And so we're kind of, is it battening down the hatches? Is that what's happening, do you think?
I think, again, for us guys, and I don't know that this is just a guy issue. I think all of us struggle with seeing ourselves as credible, as intelligent, and by golly, this is how I interpret what's happened to me. Where we go wrong, then, nothing wrong with that. Where we go wrong is when we decide that has to be everybody else's truth too, and then we begin something that Adam Waits in his book The Power of Human describes as the dehumanization of our society, and that we decide that people with opinions different than ours or information that's different from ours aren't just wrong, they're evil, they're immoral, they're unintelligent. You know the phrase "the deplorables" that was echoed by Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Those things just continue to dehumanize a great segment of our population. We seem to get pushed into the tails of two different ideas.
Well, then maybe one of the best things to do then, instead of just, so to speak, disagreeing with an opinion, is demonizing the opinion maker. And that's a dehumanization when we start demonizing people.
Yeah.
And then we don't have to treat them as humans, and we can discard them or whatever. Now, that's kind of the radical side of, I disagree with what you're saying.
That's also what makes war possible, is we dehumanize the opposition. So for those of us that grew up when we did, Bill, with the Vietnam War being kind of one of our defining moments, you almost, in order to survive, you had to dehumanize the enemy, and then it becomes okay to do unspeakable things to them.
Yeah, whatever it is that needed to be done,
yeah.
so to speak. So this is a pretty heavy thing to be laying awake at night about, as opposed to, golly, did I turn off the lights in the basement, kind of thing.
Well, sometimes I lay there and ruminate over an Ohio State loss, so that doesn't keep me awake too often.
Well, it doesn't. No,
because it doesn't happen very often.
It's very rare. It's very rare.
Yeah.
I wonder if anyone will guess what our collegiate allegiances are.
You know, really. I mean, I think we can make light of what keeps you awake at night. And do I lay my head on the pillow and does this swim around in my head every night? No, of course not. But it is the thing that I think about the most. And I guess when something gets stuck in your mind, then you see it everywhere. So when you start looking for, are people really, are we less civil as a society? Are we less empathic as a society? Are we less compassionate as a society? I see so many examples of that. I think it's rampant in our political discourse, and I don't think it just began, as some people would like to say, in the last 4 years. I think it's been evolving for decades. But we also see it in just our daily lives. The highway, again, I think is an example for me.
Yeah, when you said it's been evolving for a number of years, that's certainly true. Wherever there's people, there's this kind of issues going to be around. That's for sure. I just think in American history, thinking in terms of way back in the 1850s, in fact, we've already had some of these similar kinds of things that are happening right now. Mm-hmm. The demonization of certain populations and how problematic those people are. So if this is something that keeps you awake at night, per se, have you ever thought about what are some of the solutions or directions we could go that might ameliorate, lessen this idea of inhumanity, or maybe people should be taking more driving lessons?
So Bill, that I'm a psychology professor at a local university, and so we talk about this a lot in class, especially when we're looking at different theories, and different theorists have different perspectives on human nature. So Sigmund Freud, a name familiar to most people, really believed that human nature was mostly a dark side, had a very dark side, that we all had this death instinct, and that we project that outward onto others, and then demonizing others rather than dealing with ourselves. The behaviorists were totally different from Freud. They just believed it was stimulus, response, reward, and whatever behavior I exhibited, if it was rewarded, it was likely to reoccur. And then the humanist, who really changed our perspective on human nature, was that human nature is basically a good thing. I think all of them have a place, but I know that for me, I still strongly believed in the positive nature of our human nature. So what goes wrong? How does it happen? I used to be very fond of telling my students that there's not a resilience gene, there's not a compassion gene, but what we're learning through neurosciences is that we have human nature has a great predisposition towards empathy, civility, compassion. Now, the thing we know about predisposition being the key word is that there are some genetic markers in all human beings that say we have this capacity to be positive, to be compassionate, to be civil, and we have the possibility of not being those things too. And what makes the difference is the environment. And not only the environment you're in, but the environment you create around you. And so, and we call those environmental triggers. Bill, you could have a predisposition for heart disease. Mm-hmm. But what we know through the neurosciences today is that you can greatly alter that genetic predisposition and never develop heart disease by the choices that you make in your life, by the environment that you're in, by your access to health care, and following what science tells us is good for our health.
Larry, I kind of think, I'd like to just stretch it a little bit here. I think that compassion, which would be counter what keeps you awake all night, that compassion is a survival mechanism for humanity, because without compassion, we wouldn't be here today. And I think that just also means that you got to be with somebody, you got to be with other people, that human beings need other people to survive. There's no Lone Rangers out there that survived, per se, even though we have this idea of rugged individualism. You're not going to make it without other people. And I think compassion is about connecting, the human connection, being together, and that's a survival. That's just plain old survival.
In a nutshell, Bill, I mean that is exactly true. No man is an island, and I'm not sure whose quote that was, but
John Donne, great English poet. Yeah.
Thank you. We all require connection with other people. The only society that can exist long term is one where civility exists, and civility has to do with treating others as we would choose to be treated, reaching out to help one another.
Well, interesting that you should say that. I'm wondering what would happen if we do a little behavioral experiment for our listeners out here. Earlier, Jordan and I were recording with another person on the podcast, and he was talking about, he was a psychologist too, a professor at a university, and he was talking about asking his students to go 1 week without complaining. He was doing a lecture on complaining, and what that does to your nervous system and your neurological system, complaining, an incessant menu of complaining, what that does. And he said, do you think you'd go for a week without complaining? And the feedback he got there was pretty phenomenal. He said this one student came up to him and said, I can't do that. I like to complain. But I'm wondering what would happen if we did test drive compassion, or just to say, for this week, I'm not going to complain, and see what happens for your disposition, and see if you're less likely to be drive in a bad way, giving people a finger or cutting people off, and see what would happen to your overall demeanor for a week. Let's just try it out and see what happens. I'm a big fan of trying out something experimentally and see if you get any kind of different results. And so maybe that might be a way to help you not stay awake at night wrestling so much.
Bill, there have been a multitude of experiments exactly to that point. I've done a few things with my students in that direction as well, like sending them out into the commons area of the university with a sign saying "free hugs," and then just looking and seeing what happens, and what happens to people who, and then we try to catch somebody who either chooses not to be hugged or chooses to be hugged, and then talk to them about that. Here's what we know about human touch. It is one of the great calming influences of anything that can happen. It's human beings need human touch, and human touch, skin to skin human touch, releases a hormone known as oxytocin, and sometimes it's called the love hormone. But it's also the reason that we encourage mothers to swaddle their babies skin to skin, because it changes heart rate, it changes respiration rate, it changes everything about our experience that we're having. Some years ago, my siblings and I were taking care of a favorite aunt who was in her last months of life, and the power of human touch, just walking in and holding her hand while she was largely unconscious, and watching the information that was displayed on the little monitor next to her, and watching her heart rate slow down, just as you took and held her hand, or just as you spoke to her softly. It's very powerful. You also know, Bill, that one of my areas of interest is this new area called positive psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And in a nutshell, positive psychology is about what goes right in people's life and how does that happen. So Martin Seligman, way back in the late 1990s, addressing the American Psychological Association, said, psychology for its existence has been about what goes wrong with the human experience and then how do we help that. And he said, that's noble, that's good. We need to continue to do that. He said, but you know what? There are also people who flourish through life, who go through life and just have remarkably flourishing lives. And he said, it would be just as right to study what those people do and then try to help more people have that. So he ultimately, through now decades of research into this concept of positive psychology, has identified some very specific things that seem to make a difference in people's lives. And it follows the acronym of PERMA, P-E-R-M-A, where it talks about positive relationships. So people who have more positive relationships with others seem to do better in life. People who have engagement in their life, and by engagement he said something that got them out of bed in the morning. He says not the same for everybody, but something that gets us out of bed and makes us want to go and make a difference somehow. He also talked about the R was about having positive relationships was the R. The first P was positive affect, or how we think. And what we know today is that, again through neurosciences, is that thinking in positive directions releases a hormone in us we call them endorphins. So I think lots of people have heard of endorphins. They're the things that make us feel good, things that give us energy. Thinking in a negative direction releases a hormone called cortisol. They're the things that make us ache and make us tired. So does it matter how you think? Absolutely, it matters how you think. Just to finish off PERM, P-E-R-M. The M stood for meaning, and Seligman said, and the research says for most people that is having some sort of spiritual practice. He didn't say Christianity. He didn't say Islam. He said a spiritual practice. And people who have a spiritual practice seem to flourish more than people who don't. And then the A in PERMA was accomplishment. And accomplishment wasn't making $1 million. It was, I feel good about the fact that I have 3 children and 5 grandchildren. I feel like my life led to something greater than me.
Well, Larry, that's really good. And thank you for talking about positive psychology and the PERMA idea there. I was just thinking while you were talking that one of the reasons we don't hear lots about flourishing is it's not pathological. Depression's pathological.
Indeed.
And so that we can medicate that or whatever, and insurance will pay for that, but it isn't going to pay for flourishing. The other thing that came to my mind was, and we talked about a way to wrap that up in maybe a little package, is I was having a conversation with a friend earlier today about how to begin the morning. And morning routine and how important I think a morning routine is. And there's some good research on that, that the first 90 seconds of every conversation usually determine how the conversation's going to go. And I think the first 90 seconds of the day kind of determine how the day's going to go. And a little behavioral experiment, set your clock, get up whatever time it is, 6 o'clock, and jump out of bed and say, I've never lived this day before, as opposed to, oh crap, another day. Because you've already started off on a negative idea. And then to do 1 minute of breathing, I call that a spiritual experience, meditative, mindful breathing. And then doing, I suggested doing 50 push-ups to this guy who's certainly healthy enough to be able to do 50 push-ups. And then writing 3 things for which he might be grateful in that moment. Just that's going to take about 3 minutes to do all that stuff. But beginning the day a little differently, and that could be the beginning of a PERMA model for somebody.
So the first thing I started thinking about when you were talking about that was, you just gave it does matter how you think. From the time you wake up, you wake up and say, oh, darn, here we go again, or do you wake up saying, as you said, I've never lived today before. I can't wait to see what happens.
Yes.
Yeah, here's the other thing I think about that, Bill, is that ample research again on this. So along these whole lines of how I think and the other elements of PERMA is that when we look at what we call longitudinal research or following the same person over a lifetime.
Okay.
So one of the great experiments that in pieces of research I talk about in class has to do with World War II veterans. And they were all, the ones that they followed were all Harvard graduates in 1939 and then went off to the war. And after the war, they asked them to write their memoirs about war. And then they scored those memoirs as either more positively stated or negatively stated. Again, how do you think about your experience of having gone to war? And the narrative goes something like this. I've been to war. I've seen the worst of humanity. I've seen things no human being should ever see. And I know that I am stronger for it, that there's nothing in my life that can derail me because of my experience. That was scored as a positive memoir. Mm-hmm. The negative memoir goes something like this. I went to war. I saw the worst of humanity. I saw things that no human being should ever see. And I'll never be the same again. I'll never be able to trust other people. They followed those people for the rest of their lives. There's still a couple of them left. Mm-hmm. And here's what they have found. Those who had memoirs that were scored positively, on every measurement, did better. They lived on an average 10 years longer than the negative.
Wow.
They had better long-term, significant other relationships than those who didn't. Those who had the negative memoirs were more likely to be divorced. They were more likely to not progress in their chosen occupation. So again, this idea of not only how you think when you wake up in the morning, but how you think about the experiences that you had have a dramatic effect on your overall well-being, another term that Seligman was very interested in. What creates well-being in human beings?
Okay, Larry, we'll hunt down that study, that Harvard's longitudinal study, because that's worth putting in the show notes. I know that there's lots of good research on that, mm-hmm. and the fact that it's longitudinal is really, really important, mm-hmm. as opposed to, well, this happened once.
Right.
You can say this happened over decades.
Right.
And that says a whole lot of stuff about positivity. And this is different than, we'll just think positive. This is really important stuff.
So some people want to almost claim that this concept of positivity is sort of a Pollyanna kind of issue, that it's, oh gee, everything's just swell, and it's so much more than that. And as a matter of fact, there is a book by Barbara Fredrickson called Positivity, mm-hmm. and in it she actually lays out a ratio of positive to negative thoughts. So one might think that, well, it should be all positive thoughts. She actually says that the ratio is about 5 to 1. That you should, if you have about 5 positive thoughts to every 1 or 2 negative thoughts, that seems to be optimal in terms of just functioning in life, in flourishing, in well-being. She actually says that if that ratio would go to 10 to 1, that's less supportive of a flourishing.
I'm laughing, Larry, because in my practice as a therapist, most of my practice is with couples. I do a lot of couples work and working with guys that are trying to figure stuff out, and sometimes it's the same thing. But in the research that's been done in couples work by the Gottman Institute in particular, they call that positive sentiment override, and the ratio in really, really, really good couples is 5 to 1. For every negative event, comment, whatever you want to say, it's going to take 5 positive things to kind of counteract the toxicity of that. Now, if you're not into that really, really, really good group, but you're in one of those, also rans, mm-hmm. and it gets down to like 10 to 1, 15 to 1, 20 to 1, which there are many couples that are 20 to 1, You only need 5 bad incidents throughout the day, and you got 100 positive things you got to do to make up for that. And that is bad math.
That's bad math.
That's bad math. And again, this is research done with thousands of couples. This isn't just 2 or 3 people. So that's pretty substantial to know that positive thing that really, really works in relationships, and we should pay attention to that.
Yeah. How do the guys in those couples sessions that you're running react when you talk to them about that?
Well, Bill, if you change her, everything would work out okay.
Pretty much, isn't it?
Yeah, right.
Because us guys don't know how to retreat. We don't know how to maybe look for the compromise, or I think what Gottman called, I believe, is reparative comments.
Yeah, reparative work. Yeah. Actually, relationship repair. In another podcast I did with Ellen Anderson, we talked about relationships, and it was about how guys just listen to respond as opposed to listen to understand. And if we could just work with understanding our wife, girlfriend, or whatever partner's position, doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but just move to understand, things are a lot better. And the positivity that engenders is enormous in relationships. And why wouldn't we want to do that?
Bill, you and me know that it's the cornerstone of any successful therapy is to listen.
Yeah, right.
And to really hear what's being said and not just wait for our turn to speak.
Right. And I'm thinking about your massive work over the years with world corporations and coaching executives to learn how to listen.
I have been paid nice hourly rates to teach corporate executives, including at the very top of some of the world's largest organizations, to listen, to pause, to count to 10, and there's science behind that.
Yeah,
to not say the first thing that came to their mind, one example, I was working with a gentleman who was going to become the CEO of a major corporation, but he had this explosive temper, and the board of directors contacted me and asked me if I would work with this gentleman. It said because he's everything we need, except
that's a small thing.
And if he can't fix that, he's not going to be CEO. So, a long story. He is CEO today.
Oh, okay.
Because the first thing I said to the board is that, well, have you told him? And they said, no, we thought you could.
That's what we're paying you for.
Yeah, and I said, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. You got to tell him. Then I can maybe help him.
Yeah.
So they had a conversation with him, and so we began to do some work. And the exact things that I said to him and coached him on were counting to 10 when something. Well, the first thing I did was help him understand what are the things that sends him into that highly emotional state to where he becomes enraged, and to really be able to name what those things were, how he reacted to those things. And then what we started working on was, how do you not let those things trigger you and send you into a rage? And one of the things that I did with him is say, you got to count to 10 before you open your mouth. Now, there's some science behind that that has to do with becoming what we call emotionally hijacked. Mm-hmm. So if you can pause even 10 seconds, some of that hijacking that involves hormonal releases begins to dissipate. It doesn't go away. It takes a while to go away. But if you can even suppress 10 seconds, it helps. The other thing was not being able to say the first thing that came to his mind, had to think of something else. All of that was driving time into the process. And we know physiologically that time is the critical piece to becoming not hijacked emotionally.
Yeah, slowing things down.
He said to me at one point, he says, I've really been working on this. This seems to even be helping my marriage. I thought, no kidding.
Yeah, exactly. As you were talking about, 10 seconds pause, I think my first grade teacher, Miss Grinstead, told us that, way back 100 years ago when I was in elementary school. And again, the research about couples it says the very same thing. Is if we're in one of those tense, emotionally flooded moments, which anytime there's more than 2 emotions going on, we're already flooded. Just step out of it and say, I'm flooded, and this is not a good thing for me to be in. I need to step out of this. I'll be back in a half an hour, 2 hours, and I can resume this conversation. Again, it's putting time into the equation about slowing myself down and then going and doing something physical. I'm a big fan of doing something physical as opposed to going down and writing notes about what you're going to say to her or him when you come back. And you want to slow your reactivity down. Now, what keeps you awake at night is incivility, I think is kind of what you said. And maybe a way to get at incivility is to think of my own, in terms of myself, what is it that triggers me to these positions of anger, rage, whatever you call it, emotional hijacking, which I really like that idea. What is it that triggers me, and then what can I do to self-manage that? Because I have to manage myself on that. Knowing what those triggers are and what are the ways that I can manage those triggers might be a way for myself to work about my own incivility and not worry about yours.
So another class that I teach, Bill, at the university is in emotional intelligence. And this has relevance across our lives, not just our relationships, but also our work lives, our lives in general, and how we get along with others, how we can become more civil. And you're exactly right. It has to start with the individual. It has to start with me. And I have to start to try to understand what is it that really upsets me. So, when I teach this in class, one of the first things I have the students do is they have to work through I call them triggers, or those events that really get me upset. A lot of the students will talk about driving again. So they get enraged when somebody cuts them off on the highway. And so once we've identified what our triggers are, the things that get us upset, one of mine is people flipping cigarettes out the window. It just instantly irritates me. So I have any range of possible reactions to that. And that's what they are. They're a reaction, because that stimulus that I see goes from my visual sense to a structure in the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is designed to trigger the fight or flight response. So it says, do something now, either run or fight. And while the journey to the frontal lobe is in milli, if not milliseconds, you have to arrest that initial reaction from the amygdala.
Yeah, calm my lizard brain down.
That's right. Yeah. So
so
what could I do when that person flips out the window? I can shout at them. I can give them the international
peace sign.
The symbol of displeasure.
Yeah,
and all of that has the potential to exacerbate the situation.
Yeah. As you're talking, of course, I'm thinking about Viktor Frankl, the great psychiatrist, whose fabulous book, Man's Search for Meaning, is just, it ought to be required reading. It talks about the moment between stimulus and response. While they used to have a billion seconds, that's a long time neurologically. And we have the ability to make a decision about my response in every situation. His famous quote, something like, "They can take everything away from you," and they did in the Nazi concentration camps. They can take everything away from you except your ability to respond in any given moment in your life. And that puts the responsibility of my actions squarely upon my shoulders, and I am responsible for me. And I have a choice in every situation in which I find myself on how to respond. And so if my first inclination is to crawl up somebody's trunk because I'm mad at them while I'm driving, that's all on me. And no one's causing me to do that other than me. And so maybe I need to step out of that and lower my reactivity, because what you're basically talking about, incivility, is massive reactivity is what's happening, as opposed to responding, and move away from reactivity to learn how to be a responsive kind of person.
Exactly, Bill. Reactivity versus choosing a response that is most likely to get you a better response from the other. Yeah. So that you can boil this down to the work you do with couples again, and helping couples not to, what's the trigger from your spouse that sets you off, and how do you learn about that trigger, and then how do you consciously count to 10, take that minute or that moment just to think about what's a response here that will be better, and sometimes the better response is no response, probably the hardest one. Yeah, so absolutely. It all starts with knowing yourself. And the more you begin to know yourself, understand your triggers and your responses, and maybe choosing, I think I'd like to respond to this in a different way when this happens, the more it begins to enable you to start looking and understanding the other, which is critical if we want to return to some level of civility, some level of empathic concern for others. It's critical to understand others. You have to first start with understanding yourself.
Yeah, I wonder what would happen in my understanding of myself if I began to say, when I get into those emotionally fraught situations, to say you and I are, having a little wrestling match on something, and I say, Larry, I'm not sure on how I want to respond to you right now. I need to go think about that, and I want to come back. See, I think what happens is we get this idea that everything is instantaneous.
That doesn't fit the guy narrative, Bill.
Emergent, yeah, right.
Yeah.
But at least the model of guyness that we have. But maybe there's another model of guyness out there that's more responsive as opposed to reactive, more thoughtful as opposed to thoughtless, more, to use that well-worn word now, mindful as opposed to mindless. And see, either just try it out for a couple of days in your own life and see what happens, and see if you notice any kind of difference either in your response to other people or how people are responding to you, and see if that might be a difference you might want to keep working on.
I think that's exactly what we need to do.
Yeah. So Larry, what if how about a one-liner coaching for guys on what keeps them awake at night, particularly in light of incivility? Anything that you got that you wanted to say, a one-liner kind of thing?
I think this is more than a one-liner, Bill. It's something I said to my son. We're driving down to Columbus one Saturday morning to go to an Ohio State football game, and we're just talking about the nature of the world we live in. And this goes back to my comment about radical certainty. By God, once I've made up my mind, don't confuse me with anything else, because it's made up. And I said to my son, I said, the more you're willing to consider that you may be wrong, enhances the probability that you'll eventually be right. And he looked at me and he said, huh? And I said, well, what do you do if you're not certain that your position is right? You continue to look for additional evidence. And the more you gather more evidence, the only intelligent thing to do is if you gather new evidence that contradicts what you thought was the case, the only intelligent thing to do is incorporate the new information and maybe even, forgive me guys, change your mind. Maybe you weren't as accurate as you thought you were. So, I think we have to challenge the only way we can challenge our biases, and every one of us has them, is to first recognize that we have them and then begin to explore them and try to understand them, and even try to understand how I got them. Something I was just reading over the weekend spoke about the greatest thing that can happen to a guy that will offset potential misogamic behavior is having a daughter.
Boy, that's
no
for sure.
kidding, because it changes your whole point of reference then. I think we have to challenge our biases. We have to, it's okay to have opinions. It's okay to think, I think this is the case, but don't close yourself off. Don't stop looking at new evidence. I think this pandemic is such a great example of that, with what we thought, what science thought, and then what science continued to learn. And as science continued to learn, the advice for how we attack this pandemic has modified because we've learned new things.
Yeah, adaptation is the key to survival, if I can use it in that kind of way. The species that don't adapt, well, we know they're all extinct now. So that's an important piece. Well, Larry, that's been a great one-liner that you had there, that you talked to your son on the way to Columbus. Thanks, and Larry, thanks for coming over and chatting with me a bit and about what keeps you awake at night. Okay.
Thanks, Bill. I'm sure I'll sleep better tonight.
I know you will. Okay, thank you.